Thanks for listening to the Woodward Podcast Network. Check out more shows by searching for us on Spreaker or wherever you catch your podcasts. The Woodward Podcast Network with Krupka Dental Associates.
Hello, this is Dr. John Krupka from Krupka Dental. We now have the Soleil laser. You can have your fillings done without needles nor drills. We are a full-service dental office and always accepting new patients. To learn more about me and my friendly team, visit krupkadental.com.
Good morning. Welcome to Fresh Take. It's Wednesday, September 8th, and I'm your host, Josh Duclo, with conversations to get you thinking, not tell you what to think. Glad to have you with us on this sunny, gorgeous morning. And no torrential hailstorms in the forecast today. I hope you saw those photos of the hailstones from yesterday. Apparently they were making the rounds on the national news, because they were quite something. Those were big uns. Big hailstones. Luckily, none of those near my house. Zach Morris working the boards for us in the Myron Construction Studio. Zach, you find any of those big hailstones at your house when you got home yesterday?
Even if I had them, they would have been melted way before I got home.
Yeah, I figured. What you would have found would have been like massive dents in the siding or a broken window somewhere.
Nothing I could tell differently from the house.
Well, and it sounds like that stayed mostly north of Appleton, the North Appleton Freedom area. Sort of that band just north of Appleton specifically, with where I saw the biggest hailstones coming down. And, of course, interesting to see the way they sort of collect in the atmosphere, little stones collecting into one gigantic hailstone. But big hailstone sizes being reported all around the area, ranging from an inch up to 4 inches, which, according to Steve Balon this morning, that's larger than a softball. So some very serious hailstorms in the area. Glad we don't have that to worry about today. Maybe a scattered shower or thunderstorm in our area, but nothing like what we saw yesterday morning. Thank goodness. Let's jump into our local news on Wednesdays. We are fortunate to be joined by the publisher of the Oshkosh Herald. It's Karen Schneider, and it's brought to you by Settlers Bank. Good morning, Karen.
Good morning, Josh.
How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. I don't think we got rain here at the office, but I don't think my house got any. So
wow. Funny how that happens.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Over even a short range, that can happen. Well, the latest at Oshkosh Herald is on newsstands around the Oshkosh area now, and it's available in the digital edition at oshkoshherald.com. A great photo there of the first day of school right on the cover with brand new Oshkosh Superintendent Brian Davis. But it's inside the paper, Karen, where I want to start our conversation this morning. We've talked with county officials in a couple of different parts of the state about the redistricting timeline sort of being crunched and compressed because of delays in getting census data to county governments. But maps are being circulated. How is this being handled in Winnebago County?
So they are being circulated. There's 3 different versions that are out there that people can take a look at on the website and talk about a condensed timeline. I mean, this is going to be before the Board of Supervisors already in 2 weeks on 9/21.
Wow.
After a recommendation from the Judiciary and Public Safety Committees. So, from 9/21, and then they are hoping, after 9/21, they'll get it to the local municipalities. And, I mean, that's really not a lot of time, but they're looking for a final decision by 12/1.
Yeah.
And I keep looking at the weeks as they're flying by here, and I'm like, how is it, already September? So
well, we could start with that, yes.
Right?
The idea that the entire summer is gone and 2/3 of 2021 is behind us, hard to wrap our head around right now. But this specific timeline for county-level redistricting, we talked with folks in Calumet County who laid out a really detailed timeline for how this was going to work and then compared it to how it would normally work. And the biggest difference was normally periods where they would be open for public comment, they might have that public comment open for for weeks at a time. Instead, they'll have 48 hours for people to get their comments in. That was in Calumet County, so not speaking specifically to Winnebago, but that's some sense of the kind of changes that have had to be made to these timelines in order to fit these deadlines that didn't change in law when the data did change when it was coming from the federal government. So a real pinch and squeeze here on local officials to try to get these maps ready in time, because you have to have these in place for papers to be taken out to run in the spring 2022 elections.
Absolutely. And Winnebago County residents can go to the county website at Planning and Zoning, and there's a timeline there, too, that they can take a look at.
Perfect.
So it is definitely a squeeze, and if you want your voice heard, you need to take a look at those maps now and contact your supervisors.
Yeah, that's right. I know there's been a huge conversation around maps and fair maps and trying to change the process, so that's it. If you are in on that discussion, this is your chance. You don't have a lot of time. Get your word in to your local officials, and hopefully they'll be able to reflect your views in the process. All right, Karen.
Hopefully,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, hopefully there's not too many issues, because the current plans do not exceed a variance of 2.1% from the average of 4770, and the general rule of thumb is 10%.
Okay.
So hopefully there's not too many issues that would be brought up as being impactful.
So I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying there. There's a standard number of residents per district, and the expectation is that redistricting might change that up to 10% in any district. You're saying in these proposals, it only changes that up to 2%. And so there aren't dramatic changes, and hopefully that would mean there's not a lot of controversy with the proposals. Am I understanding right?
Yes, thank you, Josh.
Okay, all right. Listen, I read the articles and then we talk about it. I want to make sure everyone who has not had a chance to do that yet is understanding what we're saying. We don't want to leave anyone with a mistaken impression here. And when numbers are flying around, it can be very confusing sometimes. So we will leave that one there and look to page 5 of this week's edition of the Oshkosh Herald for an interesting story about e-scooters. Now, we've been hearing about the e-scooter rentals that have been flying across our region, but there's an Oshkosh-based business that says demand is high for those who want to buy the e-scooters, Karen.
Right, and they're very economical. They're $700-800 a piece, and from Kamado Electric Scooters, which is over here in the downtown Oshkosh area. If you compare that, if you don't have transportation to always needing an Uber or a Lyft or a bus pass or something like that, over the time when you'd be able to use a scooter here in Wisconsin, it would be a big cost savings. And they fall under, which I thought was very interesting, is they fall under the similar mode of transportation as bicycles.
Yeah.
So you don't need a driver's license. So if you don't have a driver's license or you can't afford a car, it's a great option.
Yeah.
So, and I love the line about they're exploring parts of the city they never knew, and enjoying what the city has to offer, which I would imagine Appleton with the Bird Rentals has recognized that as well, realized that. So that's kind of interesting, but it'll definitely come in the conversation, I would assume, about who's on the sidewalk. But what a great form of transportation. I mean, if you spend $800 a year and you are able to zip around and get to someplace timely and efficiently and safely, I mean, what a
for each individual, who is weighing these options, you got to compare that. That's right. If you're taking taxi cabs or hitching rides, and does it make sense to sort of throw the money together, get the scooter, and then be a lot more independent in your mobility? Of course, there are going to be times of the year where a scooter may not be the best choice for transportation here in Wisconsin, but you're right. The bigger question around having these things on the sidewalk will persist. I thought it was really funny, actually, in the photo that you have in your story here. You've got two scooters cruising down the street, and in the background, there's a guy going to the opposite direction on a bike on the sidewalk. And it's just funny because that is one of the big questions here. And when you've got the new technology of these scooters, of course, it's going to take some time to educate people, get them to understand, no, you do belong. We're in the bike lanes or in the shared lane where bikes are expected to be in the street. There are very limited places where those are going to be accepted on the sidewalks. Educating people about the use is going to be part of adopting a new technology. But when you think about the opportunity this presents to some people, again, it's not going to be for everyone, but for the right person in the right situation, this could be a really good option and locally made, locally sold, and really excited. Komodo electric scooters, the 300 State Street in Oshkosh. Owner Anthony Cantor talked to the Oshkosh Herald for the story on page 5. Check it out and give it some thought. Maybe that's something you or someone you know would like to get and could use as their mobility solution. A great story there about some new technology changing the way we get things done. One last thing we got to touch on, Karen. We've been following for years the saga of the Menominee Nation Arena. Most of the financial uncertainty now has been sorted out with bankruptcy. One more thing clarified at the Menominee Nation Arena recently. What was that?
Well, it's no longer the Menominee Nation Arena because that agreement has expired, and they are rebranding themselves temporarily as the Oshkosh Arena. And that, again, is just temporarily as they work to secure another naming rights sponsor for the arena. So, yes, it's being called Oshkosh Arena right now. It's sort of like Miller Park. How long are you going to call Miller Park Miller Park? But you know what I mean? So Menominee Nation Arena is being referred to, branded as Oshkosh Arena. But I don't believe they're going to be changing the signage until they have that next one because that wouldn't make sense either.
Right.
So,
if you know it's temporary, don't put up a sign you know you're going to be taking down.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. The owners said they're going to work on getting a new sponsorship agreement, and they're still continuing with their concert and event schedule and planning for the return of the Wisconsin Herd, the Milwaukee Bucks G League team. So all of that's still moving forward as a new name is attempted to be secured. Until then, we'll know it as the Oshkosh Arena. And I would love, Karen, if Oshkosh Corporation comes in as the naming sponsor, and then they can just keep it as Oshkosh Arena.
There you go.
So,
that would be awesome.
Creative solutions here to the problems that we're facing. Read more about these issues, and I got to just give this a plug. We didn't have a chance to talk about it. Read about the fishing shanties. Caitlin Scoville does a really interesting report on these historical fishing shanties along the water, some of which have some structural concerns. Really interesting for those of you who are into historical structures and sort of the old stuff around us that's still here. Check out that story from Caitlin Scoville on the cover of this week's edition of the Oshkosh Herald. You can find it at oshkoshherald.com or pick up a hard copy on newsstands throughout the Oshkosh area. And make sure you tune in every Wednesday morning when the publisher Karen Schneider joins us for our local news chat right here on WHBY. Karen, we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Josh. Have a great day.
You do the same. When we come back, yep, it happened again. I know you're shocked. Another politician telling lies. I'll have the details and we'll put it in context when we return with more Fresh Take after this on WHBY. It's Fresh Take here on WHBY, taking you to the top of the hour with the CBS News Update, our latest WHBY news and weather from First Alert Forecast at WBAY. You can always get the Doppler there if they're on TV on Channel 2.2 or on the website. They've got an embedded image just constantly going of the Doppler radar. So if you're ever looking, just real quick, WBAY.com, you can get that radar image and know what's headed our way. Luckily today, not much. Okay, before we get to the news, we need to get to yet another in our seemingly interminable series of politicians not telling the truth. I know you're all shocked. I know. We've discussed on this show frequently what some politicians have come to call the big lie. I'm not a huge fan of that moniker. We're talking about the 2020 election lies, about the election having been stolen. Even Ron Johnson, who regularly propagates that lie, has now been caught on tape acknowledging that it's not a lie, that Donald Trump did lose in Wisconsin. At least that's what Ron Johnson was willing to admit when he didn't realize he was being recorded. So some of these lies about the 2020 election, that's big stuff, right? That's undermining confidence in the fundamentals of our system. But we've also discussed some of the smaller lies that politicians tell, and they come from all sides, state, federal, local, Democrat, Republican, all of them. They're all capable and all do at times. I don't mean every politician. I mean they're all capable at times of telling lies. I've told you about the lies that State Treasurer, Democrat Sarah Godlewski, has told about having received a master's degree and the circumstances under which she did that. She was not truthful about that. She also wasn't truthful about her voting history just a few years back when she was working for presidential campaign of Hillary Clinton. So there's lies like that, again, about yourself, about what you've done in your past. When you reach the level of a statewide elected office, I think that's a big deal. And I heard from many of you that you thought those were big deals. We talked about the lies, allegedly, that Ron Wolf told in order to become a supervisor in the town of Grand Chute, lies about his residency. And when I heard from many of you on that one, you were outraged that that was even worse than some of the other lies we talked about. Now, I haven't heard any follow-up on that yet. We'll be reaching out to the Grand Chute clerk's office, find out whatever came of the opportunity Mr. Wolf had to try to establish his residency as in Grand Chute. I read to you directly from the affidavit sworn to by fellow Grand Chute board supervisor Brad Gehring, former county sheriff, attesting to his suspicions about Wolf's residency lies. And so that still remains to be seen how that one turns out. But again, Democrats and Republicans, state and local, federal takes care of itself. I don't think I need to make the point on that one. But here comes another one. This is the latest from local government, a Milwaukee City Council member, Shantia Lewis. She's also a candidate in the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate. Now, I remember when this announcement was made back in July, thinking like, what? A common council member is declaring for the U.S. Senate? Like, it just didn't really make sense to me. Did not make sense at all. I'm thinking, how could this possibly work? What is the point here? Well, I'm going to read to you from the Associated Press story out yesterday. Shantia Lewis, a member of the Milwaukee City Council and a Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate, has been charged with 4 felonies and 1 misdemeanor for allegedly stealing at least $21,000 from her campaign fund and then lying about it. Charges that 4 felonies and a misdemeanor charges were filed by the Milwaukee County District's Attorney Office on Tuesday. Lewis was first elected to the City Council in Milwaukee in 2016. She had no immediate comment on the charges. So here's something you need to understand here. This is not like the DA figured this out. The DA wasn't watching this one person and figured this out. These are the sort of things that come about from complaints. People have to have suspicions, they have to amass the evidence, and they have to present a complaint in order to get the district attorney's office to do something about this. So, like, somebody saw this. Somebody knew this was going on. They filed the complaint, and the DA felt like it was substantial enough to file not just like 1 misdemeanor for some petty little thing, 4 felonies and a misdemeanor. Because not only did she allegedly take money from her campaign funds, she then lied about it. Right? This reminds me of the story of Sturgeon General Ryan Koenigs, right? The DNR wildlife biologist who runs the sturgeon hunting spearing operation. When he was asked about some suspicions around caviar exchanges, he lied about it. He deleted his phone, all the records off his phone, the texts and the calls and everything. He wiped his phone. That's lying. And that's where you start to get into bigger problems with law enforcement, right? If you have done something wrong and you can be truthful about it. Again, I'm not a law enforcement officer. I understand what they say is they want to get these things figured out. And so if you're going to lie to them, that's when you are setting yourself up for even more consequences. So I don't know the details of these charges, but I suspect the lying about these allegations is what's fueling some of these felony charges. No comment from Shantia Lewis. I wonder who might have been the one who was watching this and who would have submitted this complaint to the DA, right? Because this is a crowded field in the U.S. Democratic Senate primary. Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes has a base of support in the Milwaukee community, including State Senator Chris Larson, who was a candidate in this field, dropped out and endorsed Barnes. Now, again, these are all people who've got contacts in Milwaukee. If they're trying to maybe play some local politics in this Senate primary, maybe somebody in the Barnes camp was watching and got some records or got a tip and submitted a complaint to the DA's office. I don't know. I have no idea. That is just a guess for how this might have worked. Because, again, when somebody does something like this, someone's got to notice and amass the evidence and compile and submit a complaint. I had a suspicion one time there was an Appleton Common Council member who was violating campaign finance rules. I didn't do anything about it because I wasn't going to be the one to put them on record as potentially these violations. I wasn't going to be the complainer. And so that's where a lot of these rules go unenforced because there's no complaints. So we'll see what comes of Milwaukee City Council member Shantia Lewis, felony charges for taking campaign funds and lying about it. We'll see what happens with that one. When we come back, I'm looking for your take. What about the bike lanes in Fox Valley communities? Are there enough? And are they marked properly enough? One man has a quest to improve bike safety, specifically on a 3-mile stretch of Wisconsin Avenue from Appleton to Little Chute. I'll have the story, and I want to hear your take after the news. Fresh Take is brought to you by Hooper Law Office. Call Sarah Kahns and Peter Harbach at 920-250-9959 for your elder law and estate planning needs. Hooper Law Office, providing a pathway to your legacy. Welcome back to the show. It's Fresh Take. I'm Josh Duclos on Wednesday, September 8th, with conversations to get you thinking, not tell you what to think. Glad to have you with us this morning. Glad to have our man Zach Morris working the boards for us. And we're going to be looking for your take on bike lanes, bike paths. The bicycling infrastructure in our community has come a long way in the last decade. But are there gaps and are there failings? Are there parts where that infrastructure needs some investment? One man says yes, and it's a cover story on the Post-Crescent, talking big about bicycling and cyclist safety on a 3-mile stretch of Wisconsin Avenue. That's also State Highway 96 between Appleton and Little Chute. His family had a close call with a near accident there, his son suffering just some minor injuries, but a real wake-up call for their family about safety in bike lanes. We'll have the details of what the bike lanes look like there, what he'd like it to look like, and I want to hear your take. Are you a cyclist? Do you use bike lanes? Are you more a bicyclist that sticks to the off-road trails? Tell me your experience with bike lanes. Are you a driver who has seen cyclists using bike lanes? And what do you think? Are they working? What have you experienced with the sharrows when the bikes are supposed to be in the lane of traffic legally? That's where they belong. What has that experience been like for you, and can we improve cyclist safety and the cooperative use of our streets here in the Fox Valley? Bike lanes are coming everywhere. Do we need more of them? Do they need to be better marked? Should they be physically separated from the road? I want to hear your take on Fox Valley bike lanes. Share it with us on the Settlers Bank phone line. 281-1150 is the number. 281-1150. Give us a call. Share your questions, your reactions, your experiences, your thoughts. Share your take on bike lanes and the cycling infrastructure in Fox Valley communities. 281-1150 or email me your take. Send that to freshhtake1150@gmail.com. Looking forward to hearing from you on this one. This has been a sort of a low simmer of an issue in our communities for a number of years. So it's interesting to me to see this come back up, get this attention, and see exactly what Jason Brozek, the man in the story, is asking for. I'll share it, and I want to hear your take. 281-1150, 281-1150, or email freshhtake1150@gmail.com. Coming later this hour, the police chief from the Fox Valley Metro Police Department, Dan Meister, is back. He's with us to talk about the new addition to his team, RACS, the K-9 unit. We'll talk about what it took to add that new piece of the department and how a K-9 unit gets used. What are some of the things they do? And back to school. We'll talk about that with Fox Valley Metro Police Chief Dan Meister when he joins us later this hour. And then in the 10 o'clock hour, we're joined by Professor from Lawrence University, Arnie Schober. Jerry's got the day off, so Arnie is going to join us, and we're going to talk about vaccine passports and begin our remembrances of 9/11, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks coming up on Saturday. We'll talk with Arnie about teaching 9/11 and then about how it has impacted our foreign policy. All of that with the Professor, Arnie Schober, today. And then we wrap it up with the takeaway. But right now I'm looking for your take. Do Fox Valley communities need better bike lanes, better bike lane markings, or just more bike lanes? Where have you seen bike lanes in need of some attention, or maybe a need of bike lanes, period? Cycling has really taken off, not just as recreation, but as transportation. And maybe you've got a neighbor or a friend or a coworker who's a real dedicated cyclist. You know they are out there pretty much all the time. People commuting on bicycles in the winter. Like, that is a thing in our community. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. Some maybe didn't realize that we're at that level of dedication. And so to try and make that practice as safe as possible, yes, to encourage more people to try it, but to make sure that those who do it can do it safely, we've seen lots and lots of bike lanes popping up all over our community. We've talked about bike lanes a couple times here, but not for a long time has this really been an issue. But the Post-Crescent has the story of one man's quest to improve one specific stretch of roadway and the safety for bicyclists. That is the stretch of Wisconsin Avenue or State Highway 96 between Appleton and Little Chute. Perhaps you've seen this at the Post-Crescent. Jason Brozek is pictured there. He is really looking for local governments and the state government to team up and try to make this route safer for cyclists. As I said, his family had a close call, his son falling on the bike and getting some scrapes, but just kind of opened his eyes. So he's been reaching out to state lawmakers, staff at the Department of Transportation, county officials, city, village, and town leaders, because just that one stretch of 96 includes City of Appleton, Town of Grand Chute, and Village of Little Chute, all at the local level, including, and then on top of, the Outagamie County officials. Each level and all of those units of government have some authority and responsibility in administering and maintaining the bike infrastructure on that stretch. But the highway, because it's a state highway, is part of the state plans, and DOT staff said there is no plan to improve the bike lanes or change anything about that right now. So what do you think? Do we need to be investing more in bike lanes? Do we have enough right now? Is there something else that we should be thinking about? I want to hear your take. Share it with us on the Settlers Bank phone line. 281-1150 is the number, and Joe is up first. Joe, thanks for the call. What's your take?
I think there are plenty of bike lanes out there. We don't need any more. I think that above and beyond that, these bicyclists, if they would just stay where they're supposed to be rather than go on in the bike lane, the traffic lanes, the sidewalk, anywhere they want to go, if they would stay where they're supposed to be, that's fine. Yeah. But I have an office right on a very busy intersection, and I see daily how these guys run red lights. They don't care who's coming from what direction. They just go. They got to assume some of this responsibility, and we don't need any more bike lanes. If they're going to make them dedicated, and that's it. They can't go anyplace else.
Right. I appreciate it, Joe. Thank you for that call. I know I've heard these sorts of anecdotes from people for years. Bicyclists that sometimes want to be considered vehicular traffic, sometimes they want to be considered pedestrians, sometimes they want to follow traffic signals, sometimes they don't. I've heard these stories, so Joe is not alone on this one. Joe's saying if they're going to be bike lanes and infrastructure dedicated to cyclists, then they should use it and stick to it. And that is a great take, Joe. I know you're not alone. Some places it's not real clear where that is. Other places it's very obvious, and people just aren't following the rules. I see it happen all the time as well. You don't have to be in a downtown to see that sort of thing. It happens all over. Now, in the case of Wisconsin Avenue, there is a bike lane. It's a 5-foot wide bike lane, and there is a shoulder, so there's technically 7 feet of pavement there along the side of the highway for bikes to go on. Jason Brozek saying that's not enough. That's not safe enough. What he'd really like is a separate lane or permanent dividers. What he's asking for temporarily is some plastic sort of flexible dividers that would separate out the bike lane from the road. Would something like that make safety better? Would that maybe be a distraction to drivers? What do you think? Could we improve the safety of our biking infrastructure? Share your take on the Settlers Bank phone line, 281-1150. Chris is up next. Chris, thanks for the call. What's your take?
Yes, I'm a avid cycler. I cycle everywhere up and down the Fox Valley, and the bike trails around here are fantastic. They're probably some of the best I've ever been on. The city streets, now, yes, cyclists do have they do have a responsibility to watch out for traffic. But I'm not such a big fan of the bike lanes around this area on the streets. I know you can go on the sidewalks, but a lot of areas are terrible for biking, like on College and Lindale.
Yeah.
Down through 41. It's awful.
Yeah.
I don't even think there is a bike lane there.
Chris, I appreciate that.
But no, I mean, yep.
Yeah, because you're right. There are spots where there's really good, well-developed infrastructure, and then there's parts where they kind of just leave you hanging. You sort of empty out of a bike lane into nothingness, and it's not really clear where you go. So I really appreciate hearing from you. So we've heard from Joe, not a cyclist, feels like the cyclists need to stick to their lanes. Chris, avid cyclist, says we've got some of the best infrastructure anywhere, but not everywhere in our area do we have that. So Chris saying, yeah, there are some gaps, some areas where that could be improved. Now, there was a key element to this story in the Post-Crescent that I thought was very interesting. And I want to get your take specifically on this one because it gets to a challenge that local governments have when behaviors change, when culture changes, when practice and trends change how people want to use infrastructure. There's a line in the story where Brozick says that Highway 96 from Appleton to Little Chute it needs to be more family friendly. He'd like to see that stretch of road be as friendly for cyclists as cycling on the Newberry Trail, the CE Trail, or the Nelson Heritage Trails. Now, if you've been on any of those trails, you know that like the Newberry Trail at times is a bike lane on Newberry Street. Like, you're right there. You're crossing railroad tracks. I mean, there's some things on that area, too, that seem a little sketchy to me, but I'm not a cyclist, so I don't know. But CE Trail, for long stretches of that one, you are literally on a separate lane, a strip of pavement. Like, it is not even part of the roadway. The Nelson Heritage Trails, again, a lot of that is not on roadways. So to try and compare a bike lane on a state highway with a bike trail that is separated on a separate strip of pavement, that I don't know that that's a fair comparison. I don't know that you could even do something on 96 like we see with a Newberry Trail or CE Trail. Now, again, you could paint much wider barriers. You could put in permanent, like, guardrails along the bike lane. Lots of this is potentially out there. None of it is on the drawing board or in the budget to be happening anytime soon. So Jason Brozick would like to see local governments do more to try to make this stretch of road safer. What do you think? If you're a cyclist, I'd really love to hear from you. What do you think of our cycling infrastructure? Is it safe enough? Does it need improvements? Share your take on the Settlers Bank phone line, 281-1150, 281-1150. And when it comes to adding bike trails, not bike lanes on already poured concrete, separate trails, you're talking about property acquisition. You might be talking about eminent domain. You're talking about adding impervious surfaces, right? That was the big controversy around Riverside Drive in Neenah. They added an off-road strip to make it safer for cyclists. And then people lose their mind. And it becomes controversial and, oh, that's this terrible thing for the environment. So there's sort of a lose-lose thing going on here in a certain respect. But I want to hear from you. Bike lanes are proliferating here. Bike trails are everywhere here. Do we need more? Do they need to be safer? Or do we have enough? Share your take on Fox Valley biking infrastructure. 281-1150 is the number, or email me, freshhtake1150@gmail.com. Back with more of your take when Fresh Take continues after this on WHBY. In about 10 minutes, we will welcome the newest K9 to Fox Valley law enforcement when we talk with Fox Valley Metro Police Chief Dan Meister about his newest officer, Rax. But right now, I'm looking for your take. Do communities in the Fox cities need better bike lanes? Local governments have a lot on their plate, and many are investing in building out local bicycle infrastructure as part of their long-term capital investment plans. They have been for years. I remember fighting at Appleton Common Council meetings a decade ago about where bike lanes should go, people losing their street parking, right? Those were in the city. We're talking here about the stretch of State Highway 96, otherwise known as Wisconsin Avenue in Appleton, that runs all the way to Little Chute along the north bank of the Fox River. Cyclist and Lawrence University professor Jason Brozick, he's involved in lots of elements of local government and the cycling community, and he's raising alarms about the safety level or relative lack thereof of cyclists on Highway 96 between Appleton and Little Chute, saying he'd like to see there to be a separate bike lane, a protected bike lane separate from the traffic. Now, again, he recognizes that will take more time and study. He knows that's not going to happen anytime soon. He's trying to get local governments and the state government aware of these issues so that they will do the study that would make such a thing as protected bike lanes possible in the future. This is why I like the way Brozek is handling this. He's going at this understanding there's lots of players in the game, from local to state, right? County to bureaucracy to lawmakers, all kinds of folks. He has had a bike ride out there with lawmakers. State Representative Lee Snodgrass suggesting the sort of flexible delineators that separate bikes from cars. You might have noticed these being put up in Appleton by railroad crossings, right? These flexible delineators, sort of like a cheaper version of a concrete median. So Representative Snodgrass suggests these flexible delineators, but that wouldn't be up to the state, right? She's a state lawmaker. That would be something local governments would have to do in maintaining the cycling infrastructure. Brozek right now is asking them just to repaint the stripes and the symbols because they're so faded you can barely see them. So I don't think he's asking for too much. I think he has realistic expectations and a real acknowledgement of the trade-offs and the balance of priorities here. So I think Brozek is doing this very well. I do think long-term it is a bit unrealistic to expect these separated bike lanes like CE has, the CE Trail along much of College Avenue, right? You're not on College Avenue. For much of it, you're on a separate trail separated from the road by like a ditch. Well, think about the stretch of 96 between Appleton and Little Chute. You've got residences right up to the road on both sides, especially on the south side of the road, between the road and the river. Those properties come right up to the road, right to the edge of the street. So where would you put a separate protected bike lane? Like if you even wanted to expand the road, you'd be buying people's property and having to, at the very least, get right-of-ways and easements in their properties to build this extra strip of pavement. And then you're going to have people who are upset because you're adding impervious surface. So I don't really know what local governments are supposed to do here. I think the way they, again, our caller Chris, an avid cyclist, saying that we have some of the best infrastructure in the area around here. I have heard that from other cyclists too. I constantly see families and other folks just out. I see all over the place, friends posting on social media about their cycling trips, big groups who are going out into the rural parts of our area, doing long trips, but also then coming back into the area, in addition to those who bike for commuting. They bike daily for professional purposes. They need to get to work. And so we need that infrastructure, and it needs to be maintained. But we also need to have realistic expectations about what is going to be put in place, what we can afford to do, what is reasonable to do, right? I don't know that it'd be reasonable to go in and try to put a separate bike lane off-road alongside Highway 96 between Appleton and Little Chute. I just don't think that's realistic. And so this is something that will take study. Again, I could be proven wrong on that. Maybe there is a method where you could go and get a separated bike lane. Maybe you put it up along a different street. Right? There's a possibility that you could use Highway J north of 41 to connect on the north side from Appleton to Little Chute and back. That might not be where people want to ride their bike. This gets back to our other caller, Joe, saying the bicyclists go where they want to go. Folks like Brozek, I know, is involved with these professional biking organizations, the nonprofits and others who are putting the word out there, promoting the courses and the routes and other things, the trails, and activities and stuff. There's a huge cycling culture in our area. I want to support that. I think that is a great thing for our area. I don't cycle at all. I do not ride bikes. So this is not about me wanting any of this. I think this is good for our community for lots of reasons, but I also think we need to have a realistic expectation for what local governments can do. And that's where I appreciate Brozek raising the alarm bell, and I appreciate the story that was put together here in the Post-Crescent by Duke Benke. I mean, one of the longtime reporters here who gets local government, he knows he needs to highlight in this story, it's really complicated. There's a lot of governments involved, not just many local governments, but the state government and the Department of Transportation all have a hand in this. So I'm glad Brozek seems to have realistic expectations. I hope other cyclists will maintain realistic expectations on this as well, as do residents, those who aren't cyclists, who have reasonable expectations, I hope, about what does need to be there for cyclists, how they're going to be a part of our transportation infrastructure. We've all got to use this stuff together. We got to get along on this stuff. We got to share. And so we need to have realistic expectations of the government providing the infrastructure as well as our fellow humans using that infrastructure. I think we'll leave that one there for now. If you've got more thoughts on the state of bike lanes and cycling infrastructure in the Fox Valley, I'd love to hear it. Email me at freshhtake1150@gmail.com. When we come back, we welcome back Fox Valley Metro Police Chief Chief Dan Meister, talking K9 Racks, a new member of the team. We'll find out how it happened, and we'll talk community policing as well when we're joined by Fox Valley Metro Police Chief Dan Meister right after this on Fresh Take. You're listening to WHBY.
Bounce in the clouds over Michigan Ocean at dawn, and the sound of the surf.
Fresh Take is brought to you by Hooper Law Office. Find their offices in Oshkosh, Green Bay, or Appleton, or find them online at hooperlawoffice.com. For your elder law and estate planning needs, Hooper Law Office, providing a pathway to your legacy. Welcome back to the show. Glad to welcome back on the Settlers Bank phone lines the Chief of the Fox Valley Metro Police Department, Dan Meister. Chief Meister, welcome back to Fresh Take.
Yeah, good morning, Josh. Thanks for having me back.
Glad to have you back. Hope you're doing well. And congratulations on adding the newest member of your team. Saw the news that the Fox Valley Metro Police Department recently celebrated the addition of a new team member, a K9 officer named Rax. Tell us about Rax and tell us the background about what went into adding this new member of your team.
Yeah, well, Rax is a first for us in our 25-year history of Fox Valley Metro. The department's never had a K9 program before. And when I came to the Valley and became the chief, I sat down with staff and talked about some of the needs and resources that we could use in our department. And one of the things that came up was having a police dog. And so I made it a priority to start this program, and it's really been a phenomenal and rewarding process. The first step we had to do is get this approved by both village boards from Little Chute and Kimberly. That was kind of an understanding and awareness thing. If we're going to add something to our department, a major resource like that, I think it's important that they understand the need and, the why, and then how we were going to fund this program.
Sure.
And so when you have the buy-in from the political leadership and the community, it makes that process go just that much easier. But one of the things that I pitched this program as is that it would be a budget-neutral program, so the taxpayers wouldn't have to pay for the dog or the associated cost, because it really is a quite expensive undertaking. And in these days of budget restraint, I didn't see us getting this program up and running through our budget. So we looked at starting a nonprofit foundation, and I reached out to people in the community who might have an interest. And there was a great outpouring of people from both communities who really wanted to help us get this program up and going. And within about 6 months, we established the Metro Police K9 Foundation, which is, again, a nonprofit foundation that has its own board. And the board started fundraising in late last year, and by February of this year, we had already exceeded our first-year goal of $85,000. In fact, right now, I think the latest count is we have about $120,000 raised for this program. So I think that's really a tribute to the people who live and work in this area. I mean, there's a lot of hard work that goes into running a nonprofit, and I appreciate all the work that these people have done for us. But it just shows the kind of people that we have in the Fox Valley who support law enforcement because they understand what it is we do and what those needs are.
Yeah, I appreciate that background there. That is the first K9 unit in the 25-year history of the department, but it's something that as soon as you arrived, it was identified as a need by the team, by the officers that were there, a priority that they wanted to invest in, and then knowing it wasn't something you're going to find within the budget, having to take that extra action, going over and above to raise that money for this addition to the force. So again, congratulations on all that work coming through, and you're right, this is a testament to the kind of community that we live in, that they prioritize this kind of thing and want to be a part of making it happen. That is a great sentiment and a great example of the kind of people that live here. So talk a little bit now about the practical considerations, Chief. How do you schedule a K9 unit? I know scheduling your officers is probably a bit of a challenge in and of itself. How do you know when you're going to need the K9 unit to be on duty, and sort of talk us a little bit about the practical considerations?
Sure. Well, first, the dog's handler, Officer Sam Pennenberg, who we selected, he will be leaving with Rax early next week for an intensive 6-week training program in New Mexico. And the reason they're going to New Mexico, we went with a group called K9 Services, and that's who other area departments have used too. So it's important, because these dogs might work together, that they have the same or similar training. But as far as scheduling goes, we have 3 main shifts
that officers staff 24 hours a day. But with only one dog, we sat down with staff and talked about, what might be prime times or, peaks or times during the day when we think we might need the dog. So we decided to go with our afternoon shift for now, kind of as a trial run thing to see how that works. And again, this program being new, we're going to be constantly assessing it to see if we need to do something different or better. But another way the dog can be deployed is the dog can be called in its off hours too. That's part of the agreement with the handler and in our policy that if our officers are, say, on the night shift and have something where they really need the dog, they can call the handler and the handler will respond during their off hours.
I see. So on call there, as I suspect most of your officers are most of the time if need be.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the kinds of things you would need to call in RACs for. Is this only about sniffing out drugs, or are there other things that RACs can do in association with this handler?
Yeah, again, in talking with staff and looking at what the other department canines are capable of doing, we decided that we were going to look for three main things from RACs. The first one, which you kind of mentioned, is the detection of illegal drugs, because we still have a problem in this area with people using dangerous drugs and overdoses. But two other things we focused in on was human scent tracking. So say we have somebody that's reported being lost, or a young child, or someone who wandered away.
Sure.
RACs may be able to pick up on that scent and help us find that person and hopefully have a positive outcome to that. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing would be tactical applications such as search and apprehension. If we have a criminal who fled from officers on foot and then maybe went into a building and is hiding or barricading themselves, we're going to try and talk them out first. But at the end of the day, it's more dangerous for a human officer to go into that unknown. So we would rather send RACs with his great sniffing and apprehension ability to hopefully get that person to come out, or if need be, the dog could be considered a use of force as well. So those are the three main applications, but there is a fourth that I think a lot of people see the dog more for than the other ones, and that's community outreach and public relations. Yes. We all know people like dogs and kids, so there is an expectation that RACs will be participating in special events and part of our community outreach program.
Very interesting. I was curious about that. I know Rax is a hardworking officer, just like the other members of your team, but I was wondering if he ever does kind of get to cut loose and let his doggy senses run and just play with kids and stuff like that. So there will be opportunities for him to engage the community as well.
Yes.
That's awesome. Really cool. And congratulations again, all the hard work that goes into this from not only you and your team, Chief Meister, but from the community supporting this great investment as well. Now, you mentioned community engagement. We'll talk a little more community policing and larger issues around that in our second segment, but it is still the back to school period. Talk a little bit about how that change in the calendar changes the day-to-day activities for you and your officers.
Yeah, it does add a little bit more work, and it's great to see the kids back. I know there was a lot of virtual, online learning last year, and we missed seeing the kids in the schools. But for our patrol division, it's basically a little bit more traffic enforcement emphasis in those school zones. Kids are crossing streets, buses are picking up and dropping off kids, so we want to really emphasize to the public that there are those posted school zones that they need to adjust their speed and slow down. But one of the things we're really fortunate to have is that our community and our school districts really see the benefit in having officers within the school working with the staff and the kids. I mean, it's really a proactive approach to curtailing negative behavior. And that negative behavior, if it's not, adjusted in those formative years, it can have a lasting consequence into that student's adult life. So we have 3 liaison officers working in the 2 school districts with the student staff to ensure a very safe learning environment for everybody who attends school.
That's great to hear, and I think you're right. Getting that positive experience with law enforcement early on can help to build those relationships and that trust that's necessary long-term for healthy community police relations. Again, we'll get to that in just one second, but last question here. Do you see many calls associated with, like, Friday night football games? Like, do you see an association of police activity required for things like that associated with the school year?
Well, generally, the school liaison officers staff those events, and sometimes we have to supplement their staffing with our patrol force. But overall, those events, I mean, there's some additional traffic in the area, but they're They're a well-behaved group of people, so it's more of a positive event. But, Josh, if I could just add one thing, I think I need to recognize another group of people that help us with back to school, and that's our adult school crossing guards. These are people that many of the students and parents see every day during drop-off and pickup, and these are people who they only work about 2 hours a day, but they're out there, when the weather's not the greatest and the traffic is very heavy. They're out there ensuring that our kids cross those streets safely. So I think there's a lot of recognition for them, and I know we are a little strained in our staffing this year, so we're actively recruiting for regular and substitute crossing guards at Fox Valley Metro as well.
Appreciate that you mentioned that. Absolutely an essential part of back to school is those crossing guards, a big part of getting kids safely to and from school. We're talking with Fox Valley Metro Police Chief Dan Meister. They're recruiting for crossing guards. If you're interested, check out the website. When we come back, we'll talk more about promoting positive relationships between police and the communities that they protect. We'll continue with that right after this when Fresh Take continues on WHBY. Real local radio, getting real about challenges to effective policing. Talking with Fox Valley Metro Police Chief Dan Meister. And Chief Meister, last summer there were protests across the country raising questions about police protection of the community. What do police-community relations look like here, and how are you making sure that you're improving that relationship?
Well, I think we've always had a great relationship with the communities that we serve. And not only with the protests last year, but with COVID, it was really a challenge to maintain those relationships. And when we talk about community relations, it's not just something that we do once in a while, like hosting an event such as National Night Out. It's really something that we strive to do every day in the community. It's really about how an officer responds to a call for service, or how they treat a person when they are stopped for a traffic violation. And it's like taking those few extra minutes at maybe, say, a neighbor dispute in an effort to solve that issue. Our officers are engaged in positive community relations every day. And it's really going that extra mile or taking that extra step to help someone who has a problem. Not just showing up at the call, restoring order, and then leaving, but staying there and helping them, from more of a long-term perspective. And what I look at is our community relations are really the product of our three core values that we embody, and those are compassion, integrity, and professionalism. And it's about establishing positive relationships and building on them in the community. So, again, we talked about COVID. It kind of put a damper on things last year, but we're coming back even stronger this year. We had National Night Out again in August. We just had a Coffee with a Cop event. But it's also about identifying ways in which we can do a better job of working with the community to enhance the overall life in the Valley for everybody. And when we talk about, because it's people that do the work and that have to go out there and maintain those relationships. So we work very hard at hiring quality people who can work under a variety of situations and under stress, and to be able to see things from a humanized perspective. I think it goes to show that good people tend to do good work. So again, we embody, when we show up at a call, we try to be compassionate towards what the person is going through and understanding what they're struggling with and how we can help them. So I guess to summarize it, for Metro, community relations, it's really a daily, ongoing work in progress. It's not something we just focus on once in a while.
Yeah, and going into each workday that there's the chance that you could have an encounter that won't end peacefully and calmly. Like, that's always a chance in your work. So is that something you and your officers are talking about and preparing for, or is that sort of just something that is lingering in the background?
No, it's something we train for, but we also talk about it. Like you said, it doesn't happen often here in the Valley, but it can happen, and it did happen to us 2 years ago with our officer-involved shooting. And that was really a wake-up moment for us because it's not something we experienced before. And there were a lot of things to think about in the aftermath of that, helping the community heal, working with the officers involved who had to be involved in that situation. So we prepare our officers physically through training and by equipping them, but the biggest thing is preparing them emotionally for these difficult types of calls for service. The training is important, but having the proper resources and tactics helps us to resolve most of these calls safely.
Yeah.
But what we really want to focus on is that our staff has an ethical mindset. That's equally important. We stress to them that the protection of life is paramount and should be a priority in any of these situations. So it goes back to those core values I talked about, compassion, understanding when we're dealing with a difficult person or a very volatile situation, trying to de-escalate it and figure out what that person is going through. We employ a high degree of integrity by ensuring that our actions are within policy and the law, that we can justify what we do. And we conduct ourselves in a highly professional manner by understanding that it's not personal when these things happen. When people disobey or disregard an officer, it's not personal, but we do have to step in and take some type of lawful action. And when dealing with the community, like we did with our incident in 2019, the biggest thing is trying to be transparent with the community, letting them know what happened and why it happened is to the extent that we can. It is our job to maintain peace and order in the community, and unfortunately, we sometimes have to use force to restore that order and peace in these dangerous or difficult situations. But it's usually a last resort, and it's one where we have exhausted all other means and tried to de-escalate the situation.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your insights on this. I know it's a difficult topic and something there's not a lot of time dedicated to discussing, so I do appreciate the chance to be able to talk a little bit about this specifically. And I want to conclude just once again with congratulations to you and the department and all of those who are involved in raising the funds to bring on new K-9 member RACs of the force. RACs and Officer Peinberg going to be headed to New Mexico for training. Best of luck to them, and best of luck to you and all of Fox Valley Metro Police Department, Chief Meister, on staying safe and keeping the community safe.
Yeah, thank you.
Really appreciate it. That's Fox Valley Metro Police Chief Dan Meister with us on the Settlers Bank phone lines. When we come back after the news, we'll be joined by Lawrence University Professor of Government Arnie Schober. He's flying solo as the professor today. Jerry off, I believe, traveling in California this week. So Arnie with us, and we'll start with vaccine passports and make our way to 9/11 as the 20th anniversary of the terror attacks in 2001 approach this weekend. We'll talk about teaching 9/11 to a generation that some of them weren't alive at the time, and what it has meant for our foreign policy. We'll talk all of that with Professor Arnie Schober when the professors join us on Fresh Take here after the news. Fresh Take is brought to you by Hooper Law Office. Find their offices in Appleton, Oshkosh, or Green Bay, or find them online at hooperlawoffice.com. For your elder law and estate planning needs, Hooper Law Office, providing a pathway to your legacy. Welcome back to the show. It's Fresh Take for Wednesday, September 8th. I'm your host, Josh Duclo, with conversations to get you thinking, not tell you what to think. Glad to have you with us. Glad to have our man, Zach Morris, working the boards for us in the Myron Construction Studio. And thrilled to welcome back one half of the professors, Lawrence University Professor of Government, Arnie Schober, joining us on the Settlers Bank phone line. Good morning, Arnie.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. You didn't suffer any traumatic hail damage yesterday, did you, Arnie?
No, thankfully, just a bunch of noise.
All right. Well, glad you made it through unscathed. We are going to turn our attention to the 20th anniversary of the September 11th terror attacks coming up later this week. We'll do that later in our conversation, both by examining the way that episode has influenced U.S. foreign policy and relations overseas, but also the way that it is influencing the teaching of American history. We'll talk about that a little bit. But I want to start our conversation this week, Arnie, on a topic that is really kind of raging across the country, with vaccine mandates becoming more common in the United States. Vaccine passports are something we're hearing more and more about. Where exactly do vaccine passports fit into the conversation as you see it?
So the idea behind a vaccine passport is this is supposed to give really the owner of a business establishment or someone in the public some confidence that you, the owner of the bearer of the vaccine passport, aren't going to be spreading, or at least theoretically spreading, COVID-19, because you have done your level best to be vaccinated, and to the best of your knowledge, you're not going to spread this disease. And so I think there's a parallel that some have made between kind of a vaccine passport and something in schools, right? You have to have certain childhood vaccinations in most circumstances to attend school, so this, in some ways, is an extension of that. There are some states, New York City, famously next week, I believe, or the end of this week, is going to start enforcing vaccine passports in the city on a list of certain kinds of establishments where a lot of people gather. We'll be watching to see how that rolls out. But other states have, California has suggested there will be a kind of a statewide database of folks who've had vaccines, although Governor Newsom there has insisted they aren't going to be a passport, but something like one. So we've seen some of that.
Yeah. So I want to draw a distinction here. A vaccine mandate, is government using its police powers to compel folks to get vaccinated. And I don't know that we've anywhere seen a sort of jurisdiction-wide mandate for vaccines being put into place. What we are seeing are these vaccine passports, what I would call vaccine verification systems, right? So it's not saying you have to be vaccinated. It's just saying that in order to access certain areas or services, you need to verify that you have been vaccinated. So there's a little bit of a difference here between vaccine passports and vaccine mandates, right?
That's correct. One of the interesting nuances of the vaccine debate, whether the government can force you to get a vaccine, relies on a 1905 case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts,
yes,
where Cambridge, Massachusetts had imposed a smallpox vaccine order. Although it had a loophole, you could pay $5, right, about $150 today, give or take. You could pay $5 and be exempt. So there, as now, the government says yes, or perhaps a private business, but says this, but there's an out. Same kind of thing here. You don't have to be vaccinated, but in states and localities that have verification or passport-like systems, you perhaps would be excluded from participating in some activities or visiting some places if you weren't vaccinated. But the choice here, again, it's you don't have to be vaccinated, but you're making a kind of a cost and benefit decision here. What do I want to do? What do I want to give up?
Yeah, that's right. And if you want to hear more about Jacobson v. Massachusetts, Kristen Shireman, attorney with Hurling Clark, unpacked it in a recent episode of The Lawyers, and you can find that as the latest edition in the Civic Revival podcast feed. If you search Civic Revival wherever you get podcasts, the latest episode is our final installment of SCOTUS Summer School, where Kristen explains the nuances of Jacobson v. Massachusetts in the context of vaccine requirements or mandates. These verifications are a little different, and Arnie, you hinted at one of the distinctions here in these questions is the difference between a private actor imposing these vaccine verification rules and government imposing something like this. The law looks at these differently, does it?
Absolutely. Private businesses have a lot more leeway in the kinds of requirements they make on their employees. After all, they have the choice to hire you in the first place, so they list out what the requirements are. Now, the government has things you can't ask about or things you can't inquire into, right, to avoid discrimination that's not related to the job at hand, right? You've got to be able to do the work, but probably your race, your creed, your color, right? These things shouldn't matter. But other than that, right, businesses can set those things up for employees, and you can extend that and say, well, what kinds of individuals can come into my store? Now, we get into a gray legal area now. Can you ban certain kinds of people from entering your store or your place of entertainment, let's say? I'm not sure all the legal ramifications on that. But it's clear that in the private sector, there's a lot more leeway. On the other hand, if the government comes in, now we have free exercise of religion, First Amendment issues, we've got free speech issues, we've got the right to the freedom to move issues, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court in a number of decisions that you have the right to move around. And so that the government, in fact, is much more constrained. I think that in the Republican Party, you see a little bit of a division here between individuals who see the role of government is to kind of create a positive environment for businesses, and then businesses do whatever they want, right? Mm-hmm. So let them do their thing, and if they want a vaccine mandate for their employees or for their patrons, that's up to them. It's not up for the state. Other Republicans, in particular, more libertarian bent, would say, no, even that is inappropriate. We have to allow the individual to have absolute freedom on the question, so even businesses shouldn't be able to make that decision about whether to accept vaccinated individuals or not.
Right.
And that's kind of an ideological question, so there's not really a right answer to it, but it does show some of the different gradations of how people might see vaccine mandates and a ban on individuals, let's say, who haven't been vaccinated on entering some kind of forum.
Yeah, for an interesting analysis and a case study in that exact conflict within the ranks of the Republican Party, I would highly recommend at thedispatch.com a piece by Andrew Egger titled "Liberty for Whom?" And the subtitle is, "In the intra-GOP fight over whether to ban private vaccine mandates in South Dakota, both sides claim to be championing freedom." And it's a pretty extended analysis and dive into this controversy where some leaders in the legislature in South Dakota want to prohibit private businesses from being able to require their employees get vaccinated, and they want the governor to back them in this. The governor doesn't agree. She says that private business is owned by individuals and they have individual rights as well. So as you said, Arnie, both sides sort of claiming to be the champions of liberty here. Is there any legal precedent or any way to sort this out, or is this really just sort of one of those ideological differences that might just have to be resolved through the political process?
Well, I think there's two, I'll call them parallel ideological questions or constitutional questions even that might be brought to bear on this. One of them that I mentioned earlier is about school vaccination. Most states have pretty stringent requirements on students entering schools and having some sorts of vaccination with exemptions, a variety of exemptions. Each state is a little bit different, but nevertheless, the provision of education, usually both public and private schools, although not always, those kids have to have some kind of vaccination. And so here, clearly the government has some authority, and the courts in the 20th century anyway, have upheld that public right. I will, as a historical asterisk here, the city of Milwaukee school board in the 1890s had one, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled against it, saying that vaccines couldn't be allowed by that. But that's 120 years ago, and is only an asterisk. The second parallel I'd like to point out here is about voting, incidentally, right? Who can we restrict from voting? What kinds of identification do you need for voting? Can the government require certain kinds of paperwork? Is that a poll tax? And that is also very fraught, although not as much on the Republican side so much now as on the Democratic side, right? Can a government prevent you from voting if you haven't paid your taxes? Can they prevent you from voting if you don't have a government-issued ID card? And the list goes on. And so here again, the government has some kind of authority to require individuals to provide proof of something to participate in a public activity. And what those limits are is very much in the political realm. But in both cases, the government has some authority to delineate who can participate in certain society's activities.
These difficult questions where rights are colliding with each other is where these controversies, I think, tend to get to be some of the most thorny, where it's just not clear where this line is drawn and where things come down. And that's what makes this conversation over vaccine mandates, mask mandates, vaccine passports, all of this not going to go away anytime soon. We appreciate a little primer on it from you, Professor Schober. When we come back, we're going to talk about the anniversary of the attacks of 9/11. In 2001, Arnold Schober was already teaching college kids. We're going to find out what that looked like then and how teaching 9/11 has changed. And later we'll look at how 9/11 impacted U.S. foreign policy and our efforts overseas. We're talking with Professor Arnie Schober, Lawrence University Professor of Government, here on Fresh Take. We'll continue with more after this on WHBY. In about 10 minutes, we'll discuss the echoes of the 9/11 terror attacks on our national security and foreign policy. But right now, what do kids these days know about September 11th? We're talking about that with Lawrence University Professor of Government Arnie Schober. He's with us on the Settlers Bank phone line. Arnie, you taught American government course on 9/11 2001. So you've been teaching this since it happened. Talk a little bit about how teaching it has changed and what students know about this event.
Well, one of the big differences between then and now is that in 2000, after September 11, 2001, many students had some kind of personal connection to people in New York or Pennsylvania or D.C., right? I, at that time, was teaching at the University of Wisconsin as a graduate student, so we had a good contingent of folks from the Northeast, and they were very deeply affected. Not only did many of them have family members or friends' family members who worked in one of the places that was directly affected, but it was home, right? And so they had a very traumatic fall, as you might expect. Over time, those memories have receded. Students now, for the most part, in most traditional college settings, are now 20 or 21, and so they were born after 9/11. And so they don't have any direct memory of that event, which makes it more challenging to teach because you have to explain the event. Why was it traumatic? Why were Americans kind of stunned and why this might happen here, especially given kind of America's involvement overseas in these places, in Afghanistan, right, for 20 years with unclear purposes. And so students have to spend, in class, I have to spend a lot of time explaining why was this a big deal, to the point that I don't talk as much about 9/11 anymore because there's just too much time explaining why it was a big deal. For me, it's kind of like my professors in college who spent hours and hours and hours talking about Johnson and Vietnam and Watergate. And Nixon is like, look, that's like 25 years ago. Why is this a big deal?
Right.
I think that same transition is happening here, too, that it's now has lost a lot of that kind of emotional punch that it had 5 years after the fact, even.
And to anyone who was cognizant at the time of what was going on, witnessed the images that we saw that day and were playing over and over in the days that followed, the trauma of that experience, not just to those who had direct personal connections, but to all Americans, seems self-evident. But what you're saying is to a lot of folks who have sort of come of age since then, the trauma of that attack isn't necessarily self-evident, and you have to actually go in and explain why this was such a painful and traumatic experience for Americans.
Yeah, I think one of the differences from before 9/11 and after, especially now, is that before 9/11 there's this sense of the United States is in a different class of countries. Problems like this, big terrorist attacks, they happen somewhere else, right? We see them in the news, right? There's not a whole lot of web at that time. I mean, there is, but not much, not like today. It's somewhere else. There's dusty streets, there's tanks rolling around, there's people with automatic weapons marching here and there. But with 9/11, that happened here. After that, I think that certainly my students don't have this same kind of America is an exceptional country. These kinds of things do happen here. We have mass shootings. We have politicians that we disagree with vehemently and will even go to the streets to protest violently sometimes about them. And so there's much less of the America is different, which I think was largely destroyed in and around 9/11, that it could happen here. And I think my students now don't have that same bubble to be burst, so to speak. They may have other bubbles to burst, but not this one. And that really is why I have to explain why that was shocking. For certainly the students with personal connections, but like you mentioned, other folks in the U.S. who said, well, this just doesn't happen here, but it did. And I think that emotional change, that emotional charge just isn't present now.
Yeah.
People could believe something like that would happen here again.
So I know this could take us to a much larger, broader conversation, but specifically to the attacks of 9/11 and this episode in American history and politics, is it possible to teach 9/11 fairly? Or is this one of those things that sort of requires a lot of sides and a lot of perspectives to gain a proper understanding of it?
Yeah, the word fair, like you note, is kind of a loaded word, right? Fair for whom?
Yeah.
And that's kind of in the eye of the beholder. I think one way to teach any topic that has controversy, especially near to the controversy, is to make sure that while you do present what the official line is, you've got to know what that is, because otherwise you can't think about it. But you should also think about, well, why is it that people would go to such extremes of kind of being suicide bombers and taking several dozens of other people with them in the case of 9/11? Why? What's ticking there? What's the reason for that? There's too much planning for it to be just a fit of mental insanity. And so you don't want to glorify that, but on the other hand, you should sit down and say, well, why is this the case? And I think that's really the ticket to many fraught topics, many topics that they're controversial, heatedly controversial, that make people angry or unsettled, is to think about why would a person with whom you vehemently disagree, why would they come to that conclusion?
Yeah.
And I think that's the way to look at 9/11. I guess the other way I've tried to teach 9/11 is to think about why did it happen, not in the sense of the perpetrators, but why did people get through the airport? What was it about American intelligence, and so on and so forth, that the event even transpired?
Yeah, there's a lot in that one event to unpack and to understand. So it's an interesting point that it's not just about the motivations of what was going on, but also the practical realities of how it actually happened. But that idea that these attacks sort of changed how Americans who were living and leading at that time saw the threats that we faced. How we thought about the world that we lived in fundamentally changed at that time. And so perhaps it's not so surprising that those who have grown up since then aren't sort of keyed into that fundamental change, or aren't necessarily coming at it from that same, what we call pre-9/11 or September 10th mindset. But we know that what has become to be known the September 12th mindset also didn't seem to last that feeling of unity of purpose and rallying around the flag that we saw there in the aftermath of 9/11. Also not surprising, but certainly hasn't lasted. And I don't think you see a lot of that in the current generation. But we're going to talk about how the 9/11 attacks changed our policy, our national security, and how we think about the rest of the world. We'll do that when we continue Reflections on 9/11, approaching the 20th anniversary of the attacks, with Lawrence University Professor of Government Arnie Schober. We'll continue the conversation after this on WHBY. Fresh Take is brought to you by Hooper Law Office. For your elder law and estate planning needs, call Sarah Kahns and Peter Harbach at 920-250-9959. Hooper Law Office, providing a pathway to your legacy. Welcome back to Fresh Take for Wednesday, September 8th. I'm your host, Josh Duclo, with conversations to get you thinking, not tell you what to think. And we're thinking about whether 9/11 truly changed everything with Lawrence University Professor of Government Arnie Schober. Arnie is with us on the Settlers Bank phone line. And Arnie, that formulation that 9/11 changed everything, that was sort of like a trope in the weeks and months following the attacks, that everything had changed. I remember we couldn't laugh anymore. It was declared the death of irony. Obviously, a lot of that was overstated, but that was the level, the depth at which our culture felt impacted by these attacks. Let's talk a little bit about the practical impact on our lives. Even as the immediate shock of the attacks faded, some of the immediate responses are still with us, including Transportation Security Administration screening at the airports. So other than taking off our shoes to get on an airplane, how did 9/11 change our daily lives?
Well, I think you hit on probably the most obvious change, and then we can think a little bit about governmental changes. But the most obvious change was this move to maybe not hyper, but that's probably the right word, hyper security in transportation. In the old days, right, if you remember flying in the 1980s, when we were having all kinds of hostage crises, even at airports, they just ask you, right, are you carrying anything dangerous, yes or no, essentially, and people would say, well, no, and then you load it with your bags. After 9/11, as anyone who's traveled by air knows, there's a lot of pretty invasive opportunities there for the security personnel to sort through your bags, do pat-down searches, do body scans, all kinds of things. And so I think more broadly what that did is it raised a level of comfort in the public with kind of intrusive searches or in a reduction in a level of privacy. My students now have a much reduced sense of privacy. I mean, they just expect Apple or Google or perhaps the government to know things it's because that's what they do.
Right.
Where before 9/11, there was a sense that there's a space that governments shouldn't go, and I think 9/11 really changed that. And the most obvious is with airport security, but more broadly as well. We've got to allow the government to keep us safe, and so we are going to give up some of those aspects of privacy that we would have demanded even a few months before.
Yeah. That idea that we would trade a bit of our liberty to enhance our security, of course, is famous and goes way back. But it's a choice that at that time people were willing to make. And it's weird because, as you said, it's not like we've gone back to our expectations of more privacy and that sort of personal zone. We've sort of given up on the idea that such a thing even exists.
Yes, really, it is surprising, maybe not surprising or shocking, but it is pervasive, the amount of material that we give up for security, but now also for convenience.
Well, right.
With the smartphone, with your Apple Watch, right, transmitting who knows what about your current physical state. I mean, a lot of things that in the wrong hands might be kind of pernicious, but it's a convenience. Between convenience and security, people really have kind of given up on a large domain of privacy.
So, okay, but that I think that begs the question, is that working, right? Has surrendering that privacy worked? Because folks will point out correctly, we have not had a 9/11 style attack on U.S. soil since 9/11. So could we say that these changes to our expectations for privacy are contributing to the security measures that are preventing another attack? Is it working?
Arguing a counterfactual is very hard, but it works. It worked well for President George W. Bush, right? We've not had another attack in my time as president, and so on. And so, on some sense, well, yes, it did work in that we haven't, and it's almost certainly the ways that individuals who want to carry out that kind of attack, they've had to adapt and think about different ways to do their stuff. So the barriers that have been put in place have worked, right? Whether the trade-off was worth it, that's for others to decide. Yeah. I think the other thing to think about is that government has, at the same time, had a lot more placed on its plate, right? It's now the government's job to keep us safe on airlines, which are private services, right? It's the government's job to keep us safe in schools from shooters. It's the government's job to keep us safe from whatever might happen in Afghanistan. And I think that expectation also rose with 9/11 to now that if something goes wrong, well, now it's also the government's fault. And I think that was also a shift, too. But did it work to stop terrorism? It certainly stopped that kind of terrorism and that era of terrorism, but it's like a balloon. It'll come out somewhere else.
Right. And to your point about people sort of expecting government is going to be the one to prevent these things and protect them, it's also reflexively now the national government, the federal government, where in an earlier era, perhaps generations ago, we might have thought more about our local police protecting us or our state government keeping us safe. Now a lot of that flows up to the national government. So very interesting point there. One last thing I want to get to, given that we have now completed a withdrawal from Afghanistan, the NATO mission to Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban government and rout Al-Qaeda, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, that's the only time that NATO's Article 5 collective defense clause has ever been invoked, and it was to defend us, the U.S. Do you think we'll ever see something like that again, where NATO will come together in defense of fellow democracies and sort of take on an opponent in that specific way? Do you think we'll see that again?
You're correct about Article 5 only being invoked after 9/11. I would, gazing into my crystal ball here, I would be surprised if it were, partly because the mission and purpose of NATO has largely evaporated, and that was to serve as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. Russia may be a burr under the saddle of the EU, but it is not the Soviet Union from the mid-20th century.
Right.
And so it's hard to say that, and especially with the 20 years in Afghanistan, it'd be hard for the U.S. or any other country really to justify bringing that kind of military action together. What kind of event would it be, and what kind of payoff would there be at the end? So I think NATO itself has some inward thinking and inward struggles about what's the purpose of the organization. But I think really the 20 years in Afghanistan should or does or would prompt a lot of thinking on the part of NATO allies about what is it for the treaty organization, and what is it in what could the individual countries get out of such an event. So I would think it would be unlikely.
Yeah, and again, we can't know the future, so I appreciate you gazing into your crystal ball for us there, Professor Schober. But this is, I think you're getting at sort of my point of the question, which is the way we think about collective defense is changing, right? European countries are wanting to get more of their own independent defense capabilities. They don't want to have to rely on the defense umbrella provided by the U.S. via NATO. The fact that NATO's only collective defense effort was to defend us after an attack on the U.S., I think maybe shows some of the flaws and the drawbacks, the weaknesses of the post-World War II security arrangements, and just how inadequate they've been to approaching and responding to the threats we see in this postmodern world of global terrorism and non-state actors and dispersed threats, lone wolves and the like. Some serious rethinking underway, but I think, as you said, it's only underway. We're certainly nowhere near understanding what this new reality requires and looks like. We're still trying to piece it together, and I think the partisan division, both in our country and in other countries, is hindering that. So I'm just going to wrap by saying I hope some reflection on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 might help us clarify our need to do this collective defense and really recommit to the need to respond to these sort of threats wherever they emanate from, whatever the political consequences might be. As unpopular as a war might be, Arnie, I said this on the show a few days back, the only thing Americans hate more than being at war is losing a war. And so we'll see what this has to bear out when another attack, should it come, actually materializes and how we respond to that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Appreciate the time, as always. Lawrence University Professor of Government Arnie Schober with us on the Settlers Bank phone line. Arnie, thanks so much.
My pleasure, but Josh, you've got to promise me that one of these shows we can do something uplifting.
I promise. We will find something. I've heard this on many shows I listen to. They're like, we got to find some good news here because it's been pretty gloomy lately. You are correct. We are going to find something good to talk about. I can't promise it's going to be next time, but we'll find something.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
Appreciate it, Arnie. Thanks so much. All right. That's the professors. If you've got a suggestion for maybe a good news topic, an angle that we could discuss with the professors next time that might be a little more uplifting, we'd love to hear it. Email us at FreshTake1150@gmail.com. Coming back, wrapping things up here for the day with the takeaway, so don't go away. More Fresh Take coming right at you on WHBY. We'll have more remembrances of 9/11 tomorrow on the show. Walt Zerenner, good friend of the show, is going to join us. He was flying in to New York City on that Tuesday morning and watched as the World Trade Center was struck by a plane while on a plane. So once he got on the ground, he then had to coordinate response for Presbyterian Hospital, where he was the chief information officer there. So Walt Zerenner going to join us tomorrow and share his personal harrowing story of what happened to him on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. Make sure you stay tuned tomorrow for that one, because you're not going to want to miss that conversation. But we're all out of time for today, and so we'll wrap it up like we always do with the takeaway. When I was a student in elementary school, I actually really liked learning the times tables. You remember talking about 1 times 6 is 6, 2 times 6 is 12, 3 times 6 is 18, right? You go on. And there was something about that regularity, the rhythm of that made it really easy for my brain. Like it really, that's how I knew I had a math brain. And now in my 40s, I love that I still have those little artifacts rattling around in my head. Because after all, math doesn't change. No matter how old you get, math doesn't change. Still, 3 times 6 is 18, just like it was in 3rd grade. But I think most adults would probably struggle at this point to rattle off their times tables or define the Pythagorean theorem. I think for most of us, math class probably feels as distant as gym class or dances after school, right? We lack a firm grasp on those math skills that we had in school. I think that's fair for most adults. I'm a weirdo. I still have a lot of this stuck in my brain. And it's good for me, but it's too bad for most people. Because we encounter mathematics and numbers in our daily lives almost constantly, especially in some of the most important news stories that are driving our culture. I mentioned several of them on Monday, and I want to zoom in today on one of the biggest stories of this current decade that we're still near the dawn of, and how math is a part of it. That, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if you've lived through it, you know the virus is only half the story. The other half of the story is about our collective and cultural response to the virus and to the response to the virus. And those responses include widespread numerical illiteracy. And again, this is something that is endemic in our society. People just don't understand the basics of mathematics. And that has contributed to the kind of misinformation and dishonest media hype that is not only driving coverage of this pandemic, but is driving the division that is resulting from some of our responses to this pandemic. I don't want to overstate it too much, but I really think this is a major factor in the COVID wars, is numerical illiteracy. And this has been true right from the outset. The very first cases of COVID were met with alarm. And at the time, I'm talking February and March of 2020, that was logical. This was a brand new virus. We didn't know anything about it. But even at that very beginning sense, there wasn't a sense of proportion in this reporting. You go back now and look at the case curve, the chart that shows you the number of daily new cases on the 7-day average. Look at that curve and go back to spring and summer of 2020. And the curve barely registers, especially when you compare to winter of 20 and 21 and this Delta wave that we're seeing now. Those early months barely even clock on the chart. But if you go back and think about the coverage at that time, the coverage lacked any attempt to understand the scale of the pandemic. Right? You'll recall in the first weeks of this pandemic, there was talk of canceling and postponing an election here in Wisconsin. And we didn't cancel it. Imagine if we did. When would we have ever done it? Because things have only gotten worse since. We have had several elections since then. When would we have ever done them? But we didn't cancel it. And so then, of course, it became a super spreader event. And that phrase has itself been spreading like wildfire, with so many other events being tagged a potential super spreader event. But is that real? I mean, from the 2020 elections to the Sturgis motorcycle rally to the Deer District crowds during the NBA championship run of the Milwaukee Bucks, lots of possible super spreader events, but no real hype on the follow-up. I wonder why. Because that's if you go back and look, and I've done this, I've shared these numbers with you, there's nothing even close to a super spreader from any of these widely targeted potential super spreaders that we were supposed to be scared about. But even failure after failure in this regard by the media in math doesn't stop them. And it's only possible for them to get away with it because of sloppy and deceptive use of numbers is never called out. The error always falls on the side of being overcautious and overscared. And when you try to point that out, you want people to die. But that's just the hysteria. That's not even the math part. Our lack of math skills is what gets them away with that. The reason they can call something a super spreader is because we don't know the numbers and we don't bother to follow up. Fine, you say. Better to be overscared than not scared enough, right? Well, I'm not so sure about that. Because as we continue to hear about tripling of cases among kids, that's again, numerator with no denominator. You're telling us how many it's up, but out of how many, right? These basic math things, we see it all the time. But you say, okay, it's better to be overcautious than not cautious enough. That is another great example of how innumeracy, our mathematical illiteracy, is killing people. And I'll explain. The Food and Drug Administration gave the Pfizer vaccine its formal approval. We still have not gotten formal approval of the Johnson & Johnson shot or the Moderna shot. They haven't even given emergency approval for the AstraZeneca shot. There's a whole other jab that's out there being used. We don't even have emergency option to use that here. Why? Because it hasn't made it through enough testing and review, the process the FDA sets forward. So what's taking so long? Other countries haven't figured out. Bureaucracy is getting in the way. And we say that's okay because we surely don't want a vaccine that's dangerous. Well, what about a virus that's spreading and killing people? Isn't that dangerous? We know that vaccines save lives. So think about how many lives would have been saved with a faster vaccine approval. This is true of all vaccines and all medications, not just with the COVID-19 vaccine. But most people are willing to let those policies go to the experts, right? But that's the problem. The experts' incentives are messed up too. There's a real risk for them. If they approve something that even one person dies, they're on the hook. Instead, they'll wait and allow hundreds of people to die. What's up with that? That's mathematical illiteracy. Instead of leveling with the American people, experts freeze. And we don't really know or understand the risk of our daily activity. We can't compare it to novel threats. And rather than educate and explain, public health professionals have teamed up with media to scare the living daylights out of us. And it's only possible because we aren't educated enough on the numbers to see it when it's happening. They don't want us doing the math and weighing our own risks. They prefer we just listen to them and do what we're told. And that's fine in a dictatorship. But in a democratic republic that requires engaged, thoughtful citizens, those citizens need to be able to do basic math. Or else there's no chance for self-governing without it. And that's the takeaway. And I've gone way long, so I'm going to have to wrap it up and hope you'll join us tomorrow when we continue our remembrances of 9/11 with Walt Zerenner. Sarah Kahns from Hooper Law Office joining us as well. Hope you'll stick around. Haley Tenpass in Focus Fox Valley is coming up next.
This isn't just any day, it's the day. The day you welcome new people to your team, or welcome an idea that changes everything. Wherever your day takes you, Comcast Business can help. With a network that can deliver gig speeds to most businesses, Comcast Business Security Edge to help protect your connected devices, and expert support 24/7. Every day in business is a big day. Comcast Business will keep you ready for what's next. Comcast Business, powering possibilities.